The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke chapter 15. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. "Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
They didn't know what to do with Felix anymore. Ever since he was a boy, he had always been very aggressive and violent. And finally, shortly before he had finished, or hoped to finish secondary school, a bunch of other youth ganged up on Felix and beat him up so badly that he apparently was left with brain damage. For several years after that, his family had sought help for Felix in one of the free government-run psychiatric clinics in Mexico City. Since after the beating, Felix had become even more violent and was constantly running away from home. Finally, however, the doctor said that there was nothing more that they could do for Felix. The family was poor and simply had no resources to keep seeking help for Felix. So they decided to tie him up. During the day, they kept him tied to a tree on their property, and during the night, they tied him to a bed. When they couldn't afford Felix's medicine, they made him sniff paint thinner to keep him sedated. That was the only way that they could control him anymore. They rarely bathed Felix and often didn't even untie him to let him go to the bathroom. For that reason, needless to say, Felix looked and smelled horrible. Due to his nervous condition, he was also constantly scratching himself so that his body was covered with sores. Felix was such a ghastly sight that some suggested that he had a demon. So they called in a Roman Catholic priest to do a rite of exorcism over Felix. And when that didn't help, they brought in instead a Pentecostal pastor to lay hands on Felix and to rebuke Satan, to use their language. But none of that did any good. Finally, Roberto came to visit Felix. Roberto had been a pastor in a conservative interdenominational church for a number of years. When he was young, his family had been helped out quite a bit by the German-speaking Lutheran congregation in Mexico City that had a number of social assistance programs. And over the years, Roberto had become close to one of the German pastors, the pastors of that congregation. Yet for that and other reasons, Roberto had been barred from the pastoral ministry of his church and expelled, together with his wife and their small daughter. Why? Because he'd begun to question many of the practices of his church. For instance, he didn't agree with the way his church treated women, prohibiting them from wearing pants or short sleeves, and saying that they had to be submissive to men in all things. He didn't agree with his church's insistence that he avoid fellowship with all other Christians, including people like the German Lutheran pastor, whom they didn't even consider to be a Christian. Roberto also rejected his church's policy that no one could be a member unless they spoke in tongues. So when he began to claim that in these and other ways his church was following oppressive practices, the conflicts grew, and finally Roberto was forced out. But Roberto loved the ministry so much that he continued to minister to others on his own. In fact, Roberto, who is also a musician, started up his own small congregation, supporting himself by opening up a school for music in a third-story room lent to him by a friend, which also served as a meeting place for the small congregation to worship. When Roberto came to visit Felix, some thought that he might try to perform some kind of rite of exorcism as others had done. But Roberto didn't believe in that anymore. Instead, he did something that left everybody speechless. He went up to Felix, the same Felix that nobody wanted to even come close to out of fear and revulsion. And he put his arms around Felix and began to gently caress his back. Roberto told me that he could hardly bear the stench and was so nauseated that he was close to vomiting. Yet he remained there for some time with his arms around Felix. And in the following days, Roberto continued to visit Felix and embrace him, constantly looking for ways to express friendship, warmth, and affection to Felix. Roberto also asked the family for permission to untie Felix, which they gave with a lot of hesitation due to Felix's history. And Roberto and his family took Felix home and got him all cleaned up. From that time on, Felix began to change profoundly. He began accompanying Roberto out on the street. His whole demeanor was transformed. And since then, Felix has never been the same. He rarely misses a Sunday at Roberto's congregation and is now doing things that no one thought he could ever do. Well, I know that's a fairly lengthy story to tell. I wanted to take the time to share it with you for a good reason. Because even though Roberto's embrace of Felix took place before Roberto became my student at the Theological Community of Mexico, in Mexico City, where I serve as a professor, that story explains why I'm so committed to doing the work I do in Mexico, which is preparing people to become pastors and leaders in the church in Mexico. In Mexico, we have lots of churches. About 85% of the people are Roman Catholic, even though only about 10 or 15% are real active in the church. As elsewhere in the developing world, in Mexico, in recent years we've seen the tremendous growth of other Christian denominations throughout the country. Most of these aren't the mainline Protestant churches like the Lutheran Church, which is actually quite small in Mexico, but independent and Pentecostal churches. And while there are no doubt many wonderful Christians in all of these churches dedicated to serving Jesus Christ and following Him, unfortunately, as Roberto's story illustrates, there's much that many of us would also find troubling. Because even though there are many churches that speak of Jesus and quote the Bible and claim to be proclaiming the gospel, my experience has been that in reality there are very few that understand the gospel as we Lutherans do and as pastors such as Roberto do. Instead of preaching God's forgiveness and grace and love for all people unconditionally, many of these churches reduce the Christian life to an endless list of rules and regulations and pronounce condemnation on those who fail to live up to the standards they've established. They read the Bible in literalist and fundamentalist ways that exclude and oppress people, especially women. They tell people who are experiencing hardships or sufferings or going through difficult times in their life that God is punishing them for their sins. They use Holy Communion as a means to discipline and exclude those they label sinners by barring them from the communion table, rather than as a way to share God's grace, behaving like the Pharisees who criticized Jesus in the gospel text for eating and drinking with sinners. I'm constantly amazed by some of the stories my students tell me about churches that they've come from and at times have been forced to leave. How people are treated when they fail to submit unquestioningly to the church authorities. How women are required to be subject to men in all things, even when they're victims of violence and abuse. How people are marginalized, disciplined, and even expelled because their marriage fails, or they have problems with their kids, or because they fail to give their tithe.